Welcome again, and thank you for joining us today for our fourth presentation in the Regenerations programming series. As Kelly mentioned, you can find past programs and our schedule for future events on our website at bishopmuseum.org/regenerations. I've been really looking forward to this talk tonight. I'm very used to writing academic articles where it's very easy to cite sources and credit your intellectual inspirations for the work that you're creating. Exhibits are a very different process, and there really isn't a space for that. And so I am really, really thrilled that we were able to invite Dr. Maile Arvin here to speak to us tonight. She has been a tremendous influence and inspiration for our exhibit, including the Regenerations name of our exhibit. So thank you very much again, Dr. Arvin, for joining us. Before I hand things over, I do have a brief introduction. Dr. Maile Arvin is an assistant professor of history and gender studies at the University of Utah. She's a Native Hawaiian feminist scholar who works on issues of race, gender, science, and colonialism in Hawaii and the broader Pacific. At the University of Utah, she is co-director of Pacific Island Studies. Her book, Possessing Polynesians, The Science of Settler Colonial Whiteness in Hawaii and Oceania, was published with Duke University Press in 2019. In 2021, Possessing Polynesians won honorable mention for Best Book in History by the Association for Asian American Studies. She is also published in the journals Meridian, American Quarterly, Native American and Indigenous Studies, Critical Ethnic Studies, The Scholar and Feminist, and Feminist Formations, as well as on the nonprofit independent news site Truth Out. And if you have not yet read her book, I highly, highly recommend it. And with that, I will hand things over to Dr. Arvin. Thank you so much.
Mahalo, Jillian. Yeah, let me see if I can get the slides up. Is that coming through okay?
That looks good to me.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, aloha mai kako, o Maile Renee Arvin ko uinoa, no kene kuke mai ao, no ho ao I loko pa'akai o Utah. He polo peka ao ma ke kulanui o Utah, he Hawaii ao. O wo ka inoa o ko'u ohana. No mai manalo mai ko'u ohana. Aloha no. Aloha no e ku'u ohana. Ai au I wai manalo I ka hale o ku'u mama I kia la. Mahalo nui loa e Kelly, a me Jillian. So mahalo. Sorry, I'm a crier, so yeah, I couldn't even get through the first two sentences. So, but I just it means a lot to be speaking to y'all today, and especially to my family. I was really excited to share an opening in Olelo, Hawaii, or Hawaiian language, because it's been my pleasure to be learning Olelo online this summer, and I know many of my classmates are also on the Zoom, so thank you all for joining as well. And so I'll just offer a partial translation of what I said haltingly in Hawaiian, and add a few things that I don't know how to say in Hawaiian yet. So I said, aloha, I was born in Kentucky. I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, which is the homeland of the Ute, Goshute, Shoshone, and Paiute peoples. I didn't know how to say that in Hawaiian, so I'm adding that. But I'm a professor at the University of Utah. My family are the Obos from Waimanalo. And you can see them on the screen. And so just sending lots of aloha to them, as well as to my Moran and Robello family, who are also watching from Manoa. And yeah, so yeah, I'm in Waimanalo at my mom's house today. I'm by myself and all my family is watching from other houses. So my daughter wouldn't come in and interrupt. So, but mahalo to my mom and my Auntie Momi for the beautiful lei that I'm wearing, if you can see. And again, thanks very much to Kelly Soliao and Jillian Swift for helping to organize my talk and hosting me virtually. Okay, so really it's such a pleasure to be speaking as part of the programming for the Regenerations exhibit at the Bishop Museum. And I'm really sorry I haven't been able to see the exhibit in person yet, but I'm really excited about how the exhibit examines and raises awareness about histories and legacies of racism in Hawaii. Specifically, the exhibit examines the work of Louis Sullivan, a physical anthropologist who took photographs of and directed plaster casts of Native Hawaiian people in the early 1920s. And I really appreciate how the exhibit highlights histories and legacies of racism in Hawaii, because too often there's a perception that Hawaii has no racism, that it has never had any racism. And this is a lie that many in power perpetuate in order to ignore the structural inequalities that they benefit from. I'm also excited that the exhibit talks about a collection that was created in the context of eugenics, the Sullivan collection, but it also highlights how Native Hawaiian families use and treasure those photographs very differently as part of their family mo'olelo or stories. So what I have to share today is taken from my book, Possessing Polynesians, and provides some historical context to the Sullivan collection, while also highlighting how Indigenous Pacific people often engage with white scientific projects in their own regenerative ways. I know the previous talks that Kelly mentioned in the programming for this exhibit, including a talk by Jillian Swift and by Keolu Fox, who are two of the curators, as well as by Elima Long, have also highlighted the history of eugenics and other forms of scientific racism. In my talk, I hope to share some further context about the history of white scientists studying Polynesian people and their origins, which both precedes and follows the era when eugenics was a widely accepted field. So the study by white social scientists, and when I'm talking about social science or what social scientists, I'm talking about the fields like anthropology or sociology. So the study by white social scientists of where Polynesians originally came from before they peopled the islands of the Eastern Pacific is deeply connected to the history of European claims to the Pacific Islands through colonialism and imperialism. Many of those social scientists claim that Polynesians were racially so-called almost white or somehow ancestrally related to Europeans. On the face of it, such a claim may not seem explicitly racist. After all, the white social scientists were saying Polynesians were kind of like them. But as I will talk more about today and cover more in my book, these white social scientists did not actually see Polynesians as white like themselves, and certainly did not argue for extending full equality or respect to Indigenous Polynesian people. Instead, they were making this false claim that Polynesians were somewhat white in order to make another false claim, namely that white people and European nations or the American nation were the rightful owners of many Polynesian islands, including Hawaii. So before I get more into it, I want to start by sharing a bit about my book's personal and academic origins. So as I mentioned, my mom grew up in Waimanalo on a Hawaiian homestead that was leased to her father by the territory of Hawaii in the early 1950s. My tutu's house, by the time I came to know it as a child on our visits from Kentucky, where I grew up, was always full of cousins, aunties, and uncles. And as beloved as that house was as I got older, I also noticed that many people in my family struggled to have permanent secure housing in Hawaii due to the high cost of living here. And my tutor's house was not always large enough to accommodate everyone. I also came to understand that it was unlikely that most of the other people in my family would ever receive their own Hawaiian homestead because of the notoriously long waiting list and or because of the blood quantum requirement. And I know many good people are working to fix many of those problems with the homesteads, including my Uncle Randy. But that blood quantum requirement, which was enshrined in law by the 1920 Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, and still is enforced today with a few amendments, states that a person must have, quote, no less than 1/2 part Hawaiian blood in order to be eligible to lease a Hawaiian homestead. So this 50% requirement, it needs to be proven through historical documentation, such as notations of a person's race on their birth certificate, which can often be elusive or flawed. In 2008, Kehaulani Kawanui published a book called Hawaiian Blood, which is about the legal history of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. And it provides a really essential account of the ways that Native Hawaiians fought for rights to land that had been illegally seized through the 1893 overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Due to the influence of the Big Five sugar corporations, which did not want to concede any land to Native Hawaiians, the homestead program ensured that a minimal number of lands deemed unsuitable for plantations would be leased to and never owned by Native Hawaiians, and limited to those who were no less than 1/2 part Hawaiian. So while Kawanui's book illuminates much about the legal and political construction of the 50% blood quantum rule and its legacies for Native Hawaiians, I wanted a deeper understanding of the idea of blood quantum itself and the history of how Native Hawaiians were understood racially. So in graduate school, one of my advisors was Denise Ferreira de Silva, and her mentorship really pushed me to seek out genealogies of race in Hawaii and the history of social scientific writings about Hawaii and the broader Pacific. Oh, sorry, I meant to say, so this pictures of my ohana, the wo ohana at the homestead in Waimanalo when my mom was growing up. So this is my Auntie Georgie, Uncle Randy, Auntie Mapu, my mom, and my Uncle Kalani. But yeah, so this work that I did about investigating this history of race in Hawaii, I felt it was needed in part because, like I said before, there's a popular and enduring myth that Hawaii has no racism, that it is a multicultural and multiracial melting pot where diverse ethnicities are universally celebrated. Though Hawaii is certainly more racially diverse than many parts of the continental United States, white supremacy and settler colonialism have embedded racial hierarchy and racist violence within the islands for a very long time. So as I began to do the research for this project, I found that this myth of racial harmony in Hawaii was tied in significant ways to an older racial fiction, namely this weird idea that Polynesians are almost white. At first, I could not explain white settlers designating Polynesians as somewhat white, but I saw it recurring so often across social scientific writings from the 19th and early 20th centuries that I was really forced to confront it. And ultimately, both myths, that of Hawaii's racial harmony and of Polynesians' supposed proximity to whiteness, I came to see, are not just products of benign ignorance, but the intentional outcomes of settler colonial science that sought to naturalize white supremacy and indigenous dispossession in the Pacific Islands. So in other words, social scientific questions about race in the Pacific Islands have never been innocent or apolitical, but are really at the root of racial categories that allow the structure of settler colonialism to operate. When I started this project, I also wanted to know how Native Hawaiians and other Polynesians worked with and against such racial knowledge. And this led me to analyze a diversity of responses across time and medium from early 20th century Maori anthropologist Te Ragi Hiroa, or he's also known as Peter Buck. His writings about his own writings about the so-called Caucasoid nature of Polynesians. I also looked at contemporary Native Hawaiian testimonies about the role of blood quantum today. And I think, and I mean, another great example is the Regenerations exhibit, really highlighting how Native Hawaiian families today access and use the Sullivan collection in different ways. I think what ties together some of these different responses to settler colonial ideas about race together for me is an Indigenous methodology that I call regenerative refusal. So regenerative refusals, I'll talk more about later, are actions that seek to restore balance and life to Indigenous communities through clear rejections of settler colonial modes of being. Analyzing such refusals alongside the history and present of what I call the settler colonial logic of possession through whiteness was important to my research, both personally, because it gave me some relief and hope as I slogged through all of these racist social scientific literatures, but also because it demonstrated consistently that settler colonial logics have never gone uncontested. So just a few more points to make before I get farther in and talk more about Sullivan. First, I wanted to offer a definition of settler colonialism for those who might not be familiar with that term, and to say a bit more about why I use that term. So settler colonialism, it refers to a political, economic, and ideological structure where Indigenous lands are claimed and exploited for profit by non-Indigenous people. And in the process, Indigenous peoples are often subject to processes of genocide, removal, forced assimilation, and many other related things, right? So settler colonialism, in the way that I think of it and use it, it's not just like a historical event that happened a long time ago and now it's over, but it's an ongoing structure. It's the ongoing structure of many nations, including the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And so what I mean by settler colonialism is ongoing is that most of the lands that settlers took from Indigenous peoples have never been returned. And many Indigenous peoples, including Native Hawaiians, are still working hard to revitalize and restore parts of their culture that have been repressed by settler colonialism. So you might ask, why use the term settler colonialism and not just colonialism, which also might be more familiar to some people. And so the answer to that is due partly to debates among academics and activists since the 1980s and 90s about another academic term, namely post-colonialism. So in the 80s, some academics, particularly writing about modern India and other parts of the former British Empire, they used post-colonial to note how India and other places were no longer officially part of the British Empire, but they still really suffered from the legacies of colonialism and imperialism there. But as that term got more popular among academics, many Native American and other Indigenous peoples in places like Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand or Aotearoa had to keep pointing out that colonialism never ended, right? Even in a superficial way on their lands. So it seemed ridiculous to call Native American context post-colonial because it wasn't even nominally post yet, right? So instead, many Indigenous scholars and activists began talking about settler colonialism to emphasize how colonialism works in places like the US and to make sure that it's not forgotten about. In Hawaii, our beloved Kumu scholar and activist Haunani K. Trask, who just recently passed away, she wrote about Hawaii as a settler colony since the 1980s and noted that colonialism has one of its goals the obliteration rather than the incorporation of Indigenous peoples. So yeah, I hope that helps. But yeah, happy to talk more about settler colonialism later as well. One other term to define is indigeneity. And if you haven't heard that term used before, it just refers to the historical and political status of Indigenous peoples' relationships to land and culture, among other things. So indigeneity is a category of analysis like race or gender or sexuality, and it intersects with those things, but it's also different. So there may be other terms that I use that are unfamiliar, and just please feel free to keep those in mind and ask them in the Q&A later about any that you'd like me to address further. Okay, so let me start saying more about the studies about Polynesia and the Pacific that predate Sullivan before I talk more about his work and also some contemporary responses. So as Europeans mapped the Pacific Ocean geographically, they also sought to catalog and categorize its native inhabitants. To many of these first Europeans in the Pacific, Polynesians seem to represent a romantic ideal of natural man in his purest state. So on this slide, you can see a painting by William Hodges, for example, which depicts Tahitian women in the style of classical Grecian bathers. This painting is called Tahiti Revisited from 1776. And here we see this very lush landscape painting with mountains and palm trees in the background, and the water of a pond or a beach in the foreground. And it's probably hard to see on your screens, but in the lower right-hand corner, there are three female figures. One that's floating in water, mostly with just her head visible. One sitting on the rocks of the beach, and her naked back and butt are visible as she undresses. And another who seems to be lounging and leaning towards the other figures. Oops. Sorry, let me go back. Yeah. So these figures, which admittedly might be hard for you to see, they really resemble classical paintings of Grecian bathers, with the one exception that one of the figures whose back is to the viewer also has a tattooed, part of her butt and leg are tattooed, which are an exotic detail that would have fascinated and titillated European audiences. So this image fit really well with the idea of Tahiti as what they called a new Cythera, which was what the French under Bougainville had officially named Tahiti when they arrived there in 1767. Cythera is the name of a Greek island which was known as the birthplace of the goddess of love, beauty, and sex, Aphrodite. And as historian Patty O'Brien argues, European ideas of Tahiti as a sexually alluring native woman would come to play a key role in imperial and colonial discourses and practices across the Pacific for many centuries to come. So these ideas about Polynesians as natural man, or in this case, women, were partly shaped by European disillusionment about the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who by the late 18th century had too often failed to live up to the idea of the noble savage. Tahitians and other Polynesians would come to replace idealized figures of natural man and warrior chiefs in European philosophy of the time. So in this line of thinking, Polynesians would be understood as beautiful, fair, and so-called almost white, in contrast to Melanesians who represented to Europeans a more savage who was dark-skinned and cannibalistic. Yes. So to explain a bit more about how these racial ideas were mapped geographically, on this slide you see a map of Oceania, or the Pacific Ocean and islands, with the regional boundaries of Polynesia, Melanesia, and Micronesia marked. These boundaries were created by Europeans. They were codified around the 1830s by the French navigator d'Urville. And on the right-hand side, you'll see Polynesia. Probably a lot of people in this audience don't need this explanation, but I really have to explain this usually on the continental US. So you'll see Polynesia marked out as this broad region that includes many different countries and territories. And that's often described as a rough triangle with Hawaii at the top and Aotearoa at the lower left and Rapa Nui or Easter Island at the lower right. It also includes Samoa, Tonga, Cook Islands, and many other places. But sometimes Polynesia is, when I'm talking about it to people, they get confused and think I'm only talking about French Polynesia, which is a specific territory within the broader region of Polynesia. Yeah, and so the poly of Polynesia refers to many, and just many islands, and the micro of Micronesia refers to small, like small islands. But the Mela of Melanesia is explicitly racial. It's from the group, Mela is from the Greek root melas, and it means black. And so Europeans called Melanesia, literally the Black Islands, referring to the people that they encountered there, which they understood as Black. So Melanesia, which is this distinct oceanic region west of Polynesia and south of Micronesia. It includes Papua New Guinea, West Papua, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Kanaki, and Fiji. And imperial and settler images of Melanesians projected fears about savage, dark-skinned cannibals and were used to justify colonization and specific practices of kidnapping and forced labor. And then in Micronesia, this northwest region of the Pacific, that includes Marianas, Guam, Palau, Marshall Islands, Nauru, among others. It's largely made up of these small atollic islands. And in the racial ideologies of Europeans, sometimes Micronesians were grouped with Polynesians and sometimes with Melanesians. And so these regional boundaries, there's a lot we could say about them, but I'll just try to quickly say, you know, the way that Europeans drew these boundaries, it had some basis in like what they observed about like cultural affinities between Polynesians. And like later anthropologists would describe Polynesians as generally organized in hierarchical societies, whereas with a royal or elite, with a ruling class, whereas Melanesian societies are generally organized around the so-called big man or chiefs that are not necessarily part of a royal class. But these boundaries that Europeans made, it also reflected some just actual physical differences in the landscape. As I noted, Micronesia has like smaller landmass because their islands are atollic, and Melanesia especially has really large land masses and a lot of minerals like copper that Europeans were eager to claim. Yeah, and so today these regional identities are taken up in some contexts like by Pacific Islanders themselves. Like in where I live in Salt Lake City, you know, there's kind of a, there's Pacific Islander, people use that term, but sometimes also just use Polynesian to kind of emphasize solidarity amongst Hawaiians, Samoans, and Tongans, right? And so there are also acknowledgements that Indigenous Pacific Islanders hold kinship relationships that predate and continue to exist across all of these regional boundaries. So these, what I'm just trying to say is that these divisions are really colonial and that many political movements attempt to overcome them for solidarity amongst Indigenous Pacific Islanders across all of these regions. Let's see. So in later social scientific studies from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th century, such ideas about the racial origins and classification of Polynesians became the subject of really intense scrutiny and debate. These were the studies that became known as investigating what they termed the Polynesian Problem. And while the theories shifted over time, the enduring logic that Polynesians could be understood as so-called more natural, classical, or otherwise primitive versions of white civilizations remained throughout changes in social scientific trends. So I argue that these racial ideas about Polynesians' almost whiteness formed this foundational logic that I call a logic of possession through whiteness that underpins settler colonial claims to Polynesia. For in this logic, both Polynesia, the place, and Polynesians, the people, become exotic feminized possessions of whiteness, possessions that never have the power to claim the property of whiteness for themselves. Rather, this logic allows white settlers to claim indigeneity in Polynesia, since according to this logic, whiteness itself is indigenous to Polynesia. So this logic really allows white settlers to claim in various ways that they are the rightful and natural owners of Polynesia, while displacing and attempting to replace Polynesians' actual claims to indigeneity, which emphasize our relationships and responsibilities to land as our ancestor. Yeah, so let me finally get to talking about Louis Sullivan. I think Sullivan's work really illustrates well what I mean about this logic of possession through whiteness. And so Sullivan, you may or may not know, was this anthropologist who worked at the Bishop Museum in the 1920s. And he actually had a joint appointment between the Bishop and the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. He was hired to undertake a definite investigation of the Polynesian elements in the Hawaiian population and to direct the production of a collection of photographs and plaster casts of living subjects to be used in the American Museum of Natural History's exhibition halls. So the photographs and plaster casts were seen as this vitally important data for the eugenics field. And eugenics at this time was a really major component of progressivism, the movement to address long-standing social problems through various forms of institutionalization and scientific modernization. So eugenicists' views towards Native Hawaiians were not necessarily explicitly anti-Hawaiian or anti-Polynesian. Indeed, Louis Sullivan saw himself as something of an advocate for Native Hawaiians, especially for what he called so-called part Hawaiians. So speaking at the Second International Congress of Eugenics in New York City in 1921, Sullivan remarked that, quote, "the part Hawaiian is biologically a better individual than the full Hawaiian, more capable of coping with modern conditions of life and civilization." Thus, Sullivan really championed mixed race Native Hawaiians because in his view, they were more quickly losing their race and indigeneity as they assimilated to modernity. Sullivan believed that racial mixing was a boon to the Native Hawaiian race because he believed in so-called hybrid vigor, which is a concept that held that racial mixes were healthier and more well-adjusted than pure Native Hawaiians, right? And yeah, all of this, you know, very strongly goes against Native Hawaiians' own ideas of their identity and genealogy, right? For many, traditionally Hawaiians, the important thing wasn't like your blood quantum, but it was your genealogy. And so it doesn't really make sense. It didn't really make sense to say part Hawaiian, right? Before some of the work, like people like Sullivan, like he created some of those categories. Yes, and so Sullivan, he used anthropometric methods to obtain physical data from Native Hawaiian subjects. So this image on this slide, you can see kind of what that looked like, right? He measured people's height, their heads, their noses, their ears. He took note of what color eyes people had, if they had an epicantic eye fold, what shape their earlobe was, how high their nasal bridge was, the slope of their forehead, shape of their lips, hair color and form, as well as skin color. And so in anthropometry, which is this discipline for which Sullivan even wrote a manual specifying a standardized set of practices, all of these features were compared to the average or common features of other races and used to construct ideal racial types. So there are these, let's see, one more slide. These are some of the facial casts that Sullivan directed and had displayed at both the American Museum and the 1921 Second International Eugenics Congress. Each photo and facial cast made from live subjects was carefully notated with that person's race. Some were labeled simply Chinese man, while all of the Native Hawaiian subjects had much more detailed fractions, allowing viewers to imagine the effects of different racial combinations. So yeah, on this slide, you can see, or you might not be able to see, but there are captions that are written across the busts of each of these casts. And they include, one says Hawaiian 3/4, white 1/4, Hawaiian 7/8, Chinese 1/8, and Hawaiian 1/4, white 1/4, Chinese 1/2. And a scholar, Ann Maxwell, has suggested that white American audiences would have viewed racial type facial casts and photographs such as Sullivan's as a way to predict what would happen if other racial groups were allowed to mix with white Americans, and if reversing the sex of the parents for each racial combination made any difference, right? So yeah, so it's kind of very disturbing way that these casts would have been used or viewed by white audiences at this time. So in addition to producing items for the American Museum's Polynesian Hall, Sullivan also understood his work as pursuing a more refined, complex answer to the classic Polynesian problem. In practice, Sullivan found this work challenging as he found Polynesians to be what he said were a badly mixed population with a wide range of physical characteristics. So kind of like no surprise when he actually measured lots of people, lots of Hawaiians, there were all kinds of different physical characteristics, right? Yeah, but to account for such differences, Sullivan came to argue that there were two types of Polynesians, what he called the Polynesians of Polynesia and the Indonesians of Polynesia. And so he illustrated these types in this 1923 article. He contrasted two Polynesian men. The one on the left, if you can see, the photo is marked as the Indonesian type. He represents the Mongoloid element with Negroid characters. And on the one on the right is the Polynesian type, in whom nature seems just to have missed producing a Caucasian. And so here there's a lot we could say about these images, and I think without the captions, right, it would be really hard to kind of deduce that this is what he was trying to prove. But basically, I think kind of connecting back to what I was saying before about Europeans seeing this racial difference between Polynesians and Melanesians, what Sullivan is doing here is kind of replicating that division within the Polynesian race itself. And so he's saying, like, there are some Polynesians who are kind of the blacker type and some that are kind of the whiter type. For Sullivan, he believed that the true Polynesian race was the whiter type. Right? Again, this is all totally bug, right? But again, I think it's important to understand kind of the logic that these people had, so because it still has legacies today. So to Sullivan, then, Polynesians might not be Caucasian, but they were, he argued, a decided step in that direction, or descendants of Caucasians, perhaps having branched off near the stem. And so this is this kind of logic that Sullivan had is really what I mean by when I talk about the logic of possession through whiteness. He's making this conditional identification between Polynesians and Caucasians, or Haole people, that does not attempt to equate Polynesians with true Caucasians. Rather, Polynesians to Sullivan were what he literally said were unsuccessful attempts of nature to make a Caucasian. So to him, they had Polynesians, we had some natural potential to become Caucasian, but it's implied they would not be able to achieve that status without intervention or guidance from other truer Caucasians. So racial mixing between Polynesians and white settlers was therefore viewed favorably by Sullivan because he saw such mixing as hastening the true whitening of Polynesians and ushering in an undoubtedly white future of Hawaii as it became more integrated into the United States as a US territory. Sullivan's research focused almost exclusively on Hapa Haoles, or Native Hawaiians who also had white ancestry, who were usually individuals who had light skin color and could at times pass as white, right? So when I talk about that, so Sullivan, you know, his photograph collection included all kinds of Hawaiians, but like his personal passion was kind of for trying to understand the true Polynesian race, right? Which he understood as only kind of white, right? So, of course, in reality, Native Hawaiians had so-called mix, not only with Haoles, but also with other Asian populations in Hawaii, and you know, lots of other races too. So, but scientists like Sullivan encourage the public to understand mixed race Native Hawaiians as whitened, no matter what the actual mixture was. Doing so downplayed the salience of racial difference in Hawaii to white American settlers there who remained a demographic minority despite wielding a monopoly over political and economic power in the territory. Okay, let's see. So yeah, lots more we could say about Sullivan, and happy to talk more about in the Q&A. I have lots more written than I can have time to say, but I just wanted to start to wrap up by talking a little bit about actually the art that is on the cover of my book, which is by this wonderful Samoan artist, Yuki Kihara. And so really in part 2 of my book, I look at how Polynesians respond to, critique, and co-opt the logic of possession through whiteness in contemporary realms of law, science, and art through what I call regenerative refusals. So regenerative refusals are actions that seek to restore balance and life to Indigenous communities that continue to live within the structures of settler colonialism. In dialogue with the theories of other Indigenous feminist scholars, including Leanne Simpson, Audra Simpson, and Lonnie Teves, regenerative refusals are, in my framing, concerned with divesting our communities from racist, sexist, and homophobic hierarchies. So Indigenous feminisms really seek to draw attention to how settler colonialism is fundamentally a gendered process that relies on the installation of heteropatriarchy to destroy colonized communities' connections to their bodies, to each other, and to the land. Heteropatriarchy refers to the organization of society such that heterosexual cisgender men are understood as naturally stronger, smarter, and better than everyone else, especially in contrast to women, children, transgender, and queer people who are understood as weak, ignorant, and often in need of reform. And so such damaging ideas imposed on Indigenous peoples through settler colonialism really often effectively upset the values of gender balance, complementarity, and diversity that traditionally knit many Indigenous societies together. So Indigenous refusals seek to restore those connections, often through the clear rejection of ongoing colonial ideologies, both imposed upon and sometimes deeply internalized within Indigenous communities. Regenerative refusals in my usage are not about a return to exactly what things were like before. They're an ongoing reckoning with settler colonialism rather than a denial of it. So yeah, I really see Yuki Kihara's work, particularly this series, which is called A Study of a Samoan Savage, as kind of enacting this regenerative refusal that I'm trying to talk about. And so let's see. So this image is from that series, and it's on the cover of my book. And what you see here is kind of just the hand of a scientist, a white scientist, like his hand is jutting off from the edge of the photograph. And he's measuring this Polynesian person's nose, just like kind of some of those images that I just showed you that come from the actual work of Louis Sullivan. And I know Yuki, really, she really studied and engaged Louis Sullivan's work in particular when she was constructing this series. So, but in Kihara's series, the subject here, she tells us, is an embodiment of Maui, which is the Polynesian demigod who slowed the sun and fished up the islands, and is one of my daughter's favorite board books. So like Sullivan's anthropometric photographs, Maui is being photographed here and being measured. But unlike in his work, in Kihara's images, the anthropometric subject seems to glow in these warm tones of brown skin that shine against the black backdrop. This warmth really contributes to the portrayal of Maui as both human and otherworldly, and contrasts with the disembodied white hand, which stands out starkly against the black background. This Maui stares directly at the viewer, or in the portraits, some of the other images in the series are oriented in profile, and they kind of more, you see that he's kind of directly staring at this off-screen scientist and kind of challenging him, right? And so this figure is played by the Samoan artist Ione, and his expressions appear defiant and annoyed at these probing metallic tools that measure his nose and skull. The tools appear sharp and potentially painful, though Maui's blank, resistant expressions betray no sign of being harmed. And all of this kind of reminds viewers that Maui is a trickster and a shapeshifter who could likely easily escape not only the anthropologist's calipers, but this bodily human form for another life form. So I'm going to show another image from that series, but there's kind of just a content warning in case you have like children around or something. But so the next image has a little bit of male nudity in it. Okay. Okay, so this piece is called Sprinting, and it deepens this association with shapeshifting by framing Maui running in this staggered photographic sequence. This futuristic influenced image, like other works of Kihara, shows him still nude, like he was being measured, in a progressive actions of sprinting from a crouched start with one knee bent to a seemingly full sprint where he appears to be running full tilt out of the frame. So most of the figures are staring directly at the viewer as he takes off, as if he is running away from both us as the viewers and the anthropologists. In the last two figures, Maile has turned his head to look forward and out of the frame as he perhaps escapes the white settler gaze and the logic of possession through whiteness that Sullivan invested in through such anthropometric studies. By running out of the anthropological frame, Kihara's Maile provides both a powerful rebuke to the violence of settler colonial science and a regenerative alternative history in which Polynesian ancestors get to refuse and frustrate anthropologists like Sullivan, right? And so Maile is an akua or god or an ancestor that most Polynesian people share across our genealogies. And by choosing Maile as the magic subject of settler colonial science, then Kihara provides a broad swath of Pacific Islanders a connection to this series and really deliberately flaunts this designation of the so-called Samoan savage that an anthropologist might use to label Maile. And the joke here is on the scientist who does not realize Maui's mana or power, and by extension, the mana of all Pacific Islanders. Okay, I'll go back to that. So yeah, I think I'll just maybe try to wrap up with that. Try to think if there's anything else I really want to impress upon people. So overall, in refusing settler colonial knowledge production of the Polynesian, Indigenous activists and artists do not just gaze back at the European, but look elsewhere to their own desires for themselves and their people. Regenerative refusals recognize violence and pain, but not to make that the center of Indigenous identity. Rather, these refusals highlight the importance of envisioning and enacting different futures that are suffused with more love, humor, connection, and freedom. This is why the energies surrounding the Kia'i, or protectors at Mauna Kea, and the powerful Kanaka Maile testimonies against federal recognition in 2014 were electric, even for those watching and supporting from afar. So those are two other kind of examples of regenerative refusal that I talk more about in the book, and I could say more about in Q&A if you're interested. For even in the face of what seemed to be unwinnable or unchangeable circumstances, in these cases, people dared to refuse and demand a different future. Refusals allow for a blooming of desires beyond the strictures of settler colonialism that pretend to be eternal and unchangeable, and beyond the settler assumption that Polynesian and Polynesians are and always will be the possessions of whiteness. So yeah, I think I'll end there, and very happy to take questions. Yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, Maile. That was really wonderful. If folks have questions, I think feel free to either enter them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself so that you can ask in real time with your voice. I think it looks like there's a question from Noel Kahanu. Noel, go ahead.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I'm wondering perhaps whether you could talk a little bit about the Bayer Dominic expedition and sort of how Sullivan's work is still taking place within this broader investigation into the Polynesian problem. Thank you.
Yeah, mahalo Noel. Yeah, I think a lot of other historians have written more about those expeditions, like Warwick Anderson and some other folks. And yeah, so I guess I don't have a lot more to say about it than yeah, I really see Sullivan's work as participating in this broader history and kind of ongoing legacy of white social scientists studying the Polynesian race, but kind of with, with all these like kind of self-interested logics, right? So I think, let's see, what else could I say? I think, let me see if I can find a slide to talk a little bit more about. Let me share my screen again. So yeah, kind of that expedition as well as a lot of other studies about the Polynesian problem, right? I didn't get time to talk too much about this, but basically there are a lot of different social scientists had different opinions about where Polynesians came from, right? And there are still studies that I talk a little bit about that in my book today, right? About that are more like in genomics or archaeology or combinations of both, where kind of teams are trying to figure out like exactly what route the earliest Polynesians might have taken into Polynesia, right? Or to from a more indigenous perspective, maybe trying to find like Hawaii or like the ancestral homeland that appears in many of our genealogical stories, right? And so, yeah, so this is an example. It's not from the Bayard Dominic expedition, but I think it's another interesting and troubling example of some of these studies. So this is from the work of Te Hiroa or Peter Buck, who is a Maori anthropologist, among many other amazing things. And he also worked at the Bishop Museum for a time. And so this is a map that's based on his work, and it shows kind of different possible like so-called origin routes or pathways that Polynesians might have taken from largely from different parts of Asia, but into Polynesia, right? And so you can see, yeah, there's kind of this big line going through Micronesia. There's maybe some ideas about Polynesians or having origins in Melanesia. There's even this outlier with a lot of question marks about Polynesians possibly having first come from Peru. And for Te Hiroa, it was complicated, right? Because he himself was Maori, and he was, I believe, really invested in kind of, empowering Polynesian people, right? And he had to navigate that while kind of being colleagues with a lot of other white social scientists, right? But so this, but the complicated thing is that he, to some extent, invested in these ideas about Polynesians being almost white, right? And so his on his map, I guess it's not clear which particular route he really believed Polynesians came from the map, but from his writing, he kind of thought that Polynesians had come through Micronesia, but before there were any indigenous people in Micronesia. So so you can kind of hear how there were a lot of like kind of complicated stories about how Polynesians could have come to Polynesia, but without having kind of so-called racially mixed with Melanesians or Micronesians. Yeah, and so I thought, sorry, I know that doesn't particularly talk to the Bayard Dominic expeditions, but just to give people more of a sense of kind of what all this kind of Polynesian problem studying was about.
Thank you. And just one final, just personal comment was that when so for Hawaiians that were veterans and went to participated, especially pre like World War I and World War II, more so World War II, when they had to make determinations of like white or black or colored restrooms, for example, Hawaiians were treated as white, not as black. And so I'm just wondering too, when you say sort of associated with whiteness, whether underneath that or part of that conversation is also this anti-blackness that that you see also recurring when when people talk about Hawaiians in the context of America.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's another part I didn't get to talk as much about. But let me see if I can. Oh yeah, so I often use this slide to kind of talk about those very issues, right? That so I'm talking about all this stuff where Hawaiians are kind of supposed to be understood as kind of white, right, by these social scientists. But like in practice, right, it didn't mean that Hawaiians were treated as white, right? In fact, it often meant that they were not, right? That almost white was really, it mattered a lot, right? And so what I talk about in my book is that this idea of Polynesians being almost white, it was also always about kind of fears about them being black, right? And so that absolutely this, you know, the context of anti-blackness, meaning like the particular forms of racism that impact Black people or people who are perceived as Black, that also really shaped these ideas about how Hawaiians were being racially identified. And so, yeah, these are political cartoons from 1893, which many people might have seen before. And you can kind of obviously, again, so much we could kind of unpack about these images, but you can really obviously see, right, that Liliuokalani is being portrayed with many of the anti-Black stereotypes that were used to depict African American people at this time as well, right? And so how I make sense of how, you know, in these studies that Hawaiians are being called almost white, but like at the same time there are, you know, images like this where Liliuokalani is being denigrated and portrayed as like not a fit queen, not a fit ruler, in this portrayal of her as like almost in blackface, right? All those ideas like went together, right? So that again, that almost white did a lot of work to. There was always ways that Hawaiians could prove that they weren't actually white enough, and so I think this is kind of an example of where. You know, Liliuokalani, despite, you know, all the amazing things that we did, how modern they were, you know, none of that mattered to some extent to these racist white people, right? Who could always kind of portray them as backwards and barbaric and savage. But that idea that Hawaiians were almost white or Polynesians were almost white, it could always be used by white people themselves to say like, well, you're not really living up to the like white standard, but because you're kind of almost white, we'll come here and help civilize you, right? Or we'll that's kind of the more liberal reading of it, or you're not living up to it, so like you're not worthy of like owning this land, right? So yeah, I think it can be kind of complicated to tease out all the nuances of that, but absolutely, I think anti-Blackness is really key to shaping how this idea of almost whiteness was and is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, mahalo. I'll stop this.
Just kind of an additional comment, maybe if you can elaborate further from Kelly. I've heard, you know, these references to Hawaiians also being the lost tribes of Israel and probably some other kind of out there origin stories, let's say, for Polynesian peoples. So where does that fit into these ideas, and is that part of the same kinds of things you're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. So Yeah, and I'm kind of focused on like the social scientists who, kind of had their own particular interest and particular ways that they disseminated this ideology about Polynesians being kind of white. Um, but yeah, definitely those same ideas were used in different ways by other parties. So yeah, absolutely, the Lost Tribe of Israel I see as kind of a similar extension of these ideas, but were often used more in a kind of religious context. So I was just talking to my auntie and uncle today about yeah, like what it's like to live in Utah, right, and how many Hawaiians and Samoans and Tongans live in Utah because the Mormon Church so heavily continues to invest in missionizing in the Pacific, right? And so, but one of the reasons why, and my colleague Hoku Aikau has a wonderful book on the history of that. But definitely I see, but anyway, so the Mormon Church saw the Polynesia as kind of a good place for them to do their missions because they had this idea of Polynesians being yeah, kind of, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll have to ask Hoku what or look at her book again to see the direct language that the Mormons used to justify it, but it was similar to like being a lost tribe of Israel and therefore kind of white enough to be considered part of the Mormon Church, right? And so yeah, I say that acknowledging all the Polynesians have their own reasons for being part of the Mormon Church, which doesn't necessarily like go along with that racist idea, but that is part of the colonial history of why the Mormon Church, came to Polynesia and Hawaii. So.
So a question from Mona Rowe about land ownership. In pre-contact Hawaii, how common was it for non-ali'i to acquire land?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I'm probably not the right person to answer it because I'm not really a historian of that time, but I think there are a lot of great resources on that, like by Lily Kala Kame'ele Hiva has a great book on native land, foreign desires. That talks a lot about kind of land tenure and ownership and how it changed in the 1800s. But I guess my general answer would probably be, I mean, traditionally Native Hawaiians and many other indigenous peoples don't have an idea of owning land, right? Like that's a pretty Western idea. And the introduction of that idea to Hawaii was really a major part of colonialism, right? And so traditionally Hawaii, land was organized within the Ahu Pua'a system, right? Where kind of there were districts where people worked together from the mountain to the ocean and farmed the land and fished and shared what they had with everyone, right? And so, yeah, I guess that's kind of what my very general answer to that. Yeah, and certainly kind of as yeah, well, again, I'm not really an expert on kind of the li'i, but yeah, thank you for that point.
One thing I was really struck by when you were talking, even as someone who has done some research for this exhibit on kind of Sullivan's work and thinking about lasting legacies, you said Sullivan at least played a role, if not created, the category and this idea of thinking about part Hawaiian. And I just, this is not really a question, but if you want to elaborate further, I just thought that was it really drove home how kind of damaging and transformative that shift of thinking and the imposition of that kind of thinking probably was. Yeah.
Yeah, mahalo, Jillian. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can like credit any one person with that idea, but I definitely I think there are ways you might say part Hawaiian in a very innocent, innocuous way, but I think kind of some of the more kind of lasting damage that ideas like that have done comes from people like Sullivan that encourage people to think about Hawaiians as so-called racially mixing and therefore diminishing their race by whitening the race and kind of dying out, right? So yeah, so I think I do think it's really important to kind of realize that that idea it has a history, right? It's not necessarily a natural idea that Hawaiians always had, but it came from somewhere, right? And it has real impacts on people and our our Lahui, our nation.
Mahalo, Maile. I wanted to know a little bit about your journey on how you came into this field. I mean, there's a lot coming out nowadays about some of the history in this way, but wondering how did you like what was your journey into this kind of study?
Yeah, sorry, is that Kelly asking?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I hear the voice, but I wasn't sure where. Yeah, I mean, I tried to say a bit about that in the beginning of my talk. It's partly I partly came to this work because I'm Hawaiian and because um, I partly grew up away from Hawaii. I grew up in Kentucky, but like I said, my family is from Waimanalo, from Homestead, and as I grew up, just kind of learning more about the history of homesteads and then the history of the blood quantum requirement, it just left me with a lot of questions that even as a lot of other great scholarship was coming out, like Kehaulani Kauanui's book, which is a really great kind of legal history of the blood quantum requirement. I still had so many questions about like, where did that idea of blood quantum come from? Like at all, like how is this an idea that that came to shape Native Hawaiians' lives, right? And so that and working with one of my mentors in grad school who does a lot of looks at kind of really foundational logics about race in like Enlightenment philosophy and social scientific writings. That's kind of what drew me to trying to look more into the history of like how Polynesians were understood as a race by European people, and like what kind of what all the weird and wacky theories were that they had, and how the legacies of those theories came to impact Native Hawaiians.
Hi, Maile, you're back.
Hi, yeah, sorry, my internet cut out, but hopefully it'll hold on for a few more minutes.
Yes. So, yeah, I just was asking you mostly because just it seems like what was your area of study at the university at that time? Because now you have like a PhD and it's women's studies and things like that. So I was just wondering uh, how it all mixed together and then this book comes out, you know?
Yeah, well, yeah, so my PhD was in ethnic studies. So yeah, so, everything I was learning in grad school was a lot about race and racialization and, but also about like how people of color and Indigenous people, challenge those ideas, have always, and will always challenge those ideas, right? And so, yeah, that's, yeah, and yeah, I guess I could say like, especially when I started ethnic studies, didn't always do a great job of like talking about race and Pacific Islander people or Native Hawaiian people. And so I think I kind of had to carve my own way sometimes. And I think, as I early in my graduate school career, the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association started. And so that became a really important community for me to be in conversation with other Indigenous studies scholars. And yeah.
Mahalo.
While you were gone, we had a couple really good questions come up in chat. And so I want to make time to ask you both of these. And then I also saw that Ka'ohana Avo has something to say at the end. So I'd like to let them close after these next two questions, if that works for you.
Sure, mahalo.
So the first one I have is from Kapaliku, Maile. A question, in your experience with Kanaka Hawaii and Kanaka Paki Pika communities in Utah, how do you see contemporary discussions around blood quantum and hapa-ness framed?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's complicated to say anything easy about it, right? Because everyone has different different experiences and different different opinions. But I feel like I have noticed, it's only Hawaiians who kind of have this legal blood quantum system, right? As I could be wrong, but as far as I know, in Samoa or American Samoa or other parts of Polynesia, it's not like, those places still have colonialism, but they might not necessarily have, but it looks different, right? And it might, and there might not be a formal like system of blood quantum. And I think, and so I think, yeah, certainly like Samoans and Tongans might like refer to themselves as like half or part, or there's like afakasi, right, or other terms. But I think, and it's my bias because I'm Hawaiian, right? And I am technically at Sullivan would see me as part Hawaiian, right? I feel like for Hawaiians, there's all this, there's a lot of baggage that goes along with those like part designations, right? That come from this colonial history and like ongoing colonial legacies, right? So, so I'm sure there are also many similarities and connections between the kinds of colonialism that happen in other parts of Polynesia and Hawaii. But just to kind of try to answer that question, I feel like from what I noticed living in Utah, it feels like the blood quantum stuff is kind of unique to Hawaiians.
Thank you. I've got a two-parter from Karen Kosasa to end the questions. So one, would you talk about the significance of your scholarly research being used for a general museum audience, especially for your family? And the second part of that is talk about the importance of a museum reflecting on its past history and complicity with scientific racism or racist practices, and why is this important?
Yeah, thanks, mahalo, Karen, for those questions. Yeah, I really wish I was able to see the exhibit before I had my talk, so I could kind of say more about that, especially the second part. But yeah, I feel like it. I'm so heartened to know that people like Jillian and others at the Bishop Museum are really interested in confronting the complicity of Bishop Museum's, role in creating some of these colonial ideologies, right, that still really impact Native Hawaiian people. Because I think a lot of museums, even today, even in a context where a lot of museums are trying to do better, that doesn't necessarily mean that that they are, right? And so what I really appreciate from what I've read of like the online or other notes about the Regenerations exhibit is that it really seems open to Bishop Museum seems open to critique of its own role in these practices, right? And I think that's really good and a really important step. It's only a first step, as I think Jillian and others know, because it has to kind of be an ongoing commitment to change and to make sure that You know, like a lot of the stuff that I talk about, it might seem really outlandish, right? To talk about Hawaiians as almost white and, you know, from this history of eugenics. But like I'm trying to say, those ideas have real impacts that continue today, right? So the museum has to also acknowledge, yeah, just the ongoing nature of all of this stuff. So it can't be like a one-off, oh, sorry, we hired Sullivan and he was really racist. But it's great that he made these photographs that we can now look at, right? Which, you know, it is great to have those photographs. But it has to be a more ongoing work that we can't, that has to be more of like a daily practice, right? And I think that's really hard, and there's no one way to do that. But again, I'm really heartened that Jillian and others seem really interested in doing that work. And yeah, more to the first part of the question. Yeah, I mean, I'm thrilled that that my book had a small part in inspiring the exhibit. And yeah, maybe my family could say what they think about it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I do just want to very quickly acknowledge another exhibit curator who's here, Leah Caldera. She's the director of library and archives and has really been leading these efforts to change our exhibit practices, change the way we think about our collections, and to really drive these practices forward and help our museum. So many thanks to her as well. We have about 5 minutes left, so I did want to hand things over to the Avo Ohana, who have something they'd like to say before we close out tonight. So it's all yours.
Aloha e Maile. I'm going to keep it short. I think we want to there's a lot we could say, but as you can see, there's a lot of good reasons to keep it short. We wanted to let you know first how proud we are of you, your work, your accomplishments, and we want to mahalo you for honoring your culture, honoring your family, recognizing the piko of our family is Waimanalo, no matter where we travel in the world. We want to mahalo you for helping the world as well as ourselves understand our place in the world, for carrying that message no matter where you are. So mahalo nui. And our Ohana wants to close this with Oli Mahalo.
Uhola ia ka makaloala, ua ike alohala, kuka ia ka haloala, hawehi mai nā lehua, mai ka ho'oku ia ka halawaila. Mahalo e nā akua, mahalo e nā kupunala ea, mahalo
Aloha, Maile. Aloha.
Good job, Maile.
Oh, mahalo nui. I'll say more later. I can't say more without crying now. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maile Arvin, and thank you to your family as well for providing a perfect close for this event. We're so honored to have you here, and we're so grateful. That's all I can really say. I can't add to that. That was wonderful. Thank you. And I'll just wish everyone a good night, and I hope we see you for our next event as well.